So again, without further ado, I will hand this over to Elad, Walach, Aidoc's CEO, to introduce Rick, Dr. Rick Abramson, and talk to us a bit about AI and large health systems and how this is becoming a corporate objective. I'm sure we will all find this very interesting. So over to you, Elad.
Thanks, Ariella. And maybe I'll start introducing Rick for a second. So Rick, I'm so happy you're here with us. I know you have vast experience both in academic, major health system on the executive side. So can you tell us a bit about your experience before we dive in?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. And let me just say thank you so much for inviting me on the webinar. I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks to all the attendees, everyone who registered for the webinar. We were just chatting before we started about how everyone is suffering from Zoom fatigue. Everyone's sick of webinars, and really excited that the registration and the turnout was so great without Ariella having to send out cocktail kits or whatnot. So so thanks so much for having me. Elad, I was just thinking back to when you and I first met. It was at RSNA. I can't remember how many years ago, but I remember I was, for some reason, very, very late in making my way over to the exhibit hall, and I want to say it was actually late on a Thursday afternoon before I finally made my way over to the Aidoc booth, and it was late. It had been a hectic week, and there were all around us there were people dismantling their exhibits, dismantling their booths, and so you could hear drills going, and people were walking by with their poster boards or whatever. Everyone just wanted to get out of Chicago. But you and your team, Tom was there, Dimitri was there. You guys were so patient with me, taking me through a lot of your demos and answering my questions. And I really appreciated the patience that you showed with me. You were very generous with your time, and that, of course, was the beginning of a really nice relationship that's continued through. So again, thank you so much for having me. By way of introduction, I'm one of those radiologists, and there are several of us out there who have had kind of an unorthodox career trajectory. For me, it's been popping back and forth between the clinical and non-clinical sides and back again, including time spent in management consulting, some time doing health policy work in DC, a nice productive stint in academics where I taught and practiced and also did research that got into a lot of machine learning and AI. And then most recently, over the course of the past 2.5 years, a role at HCA Healthcare, where I built and led an enterprise service line for radiology from the corporate office. So just real quickly for those viewers who may not be familiar with HCA, this is the largest for-profit health system in the US, about $45 billion in annual revenue. And when I was there, at least, operated 185 hospitals across 22 states, plus a handful of facilities in the UK. That number is actually growing. There's some additional acquisitions that HCA has recently announced. But it was, for me, just an incredible role, and one that kind of gave it one of those unusual vantage points and really provided insight from the corporate enterprise level into all dimensions of imaging, ranging from radiology professional contracting to quality and safety, to operations, to growth strategy. And toward the end of my tenure, a lot of work in imaging informatics and a lot of work with data science and AI. So I left HCA a couple months ago, as you know, and I've taken on a new position with Covera Health, which is a role that I'm really excited about. But this webinar is all about AI in large health systems. So great topic, really excited to dive in with you. So let's get going.
Terrific. And Rick, I think that what excites me and why I think we have interest in this webinar is AI is moving through, I would say, the stages of adoption, right? So you had the early adopters, which are, I would say, typically the big academics, but I think that over the past year or so, it really started going into much more of the health systems and community hospitals. And I just literally this morning I saw about AI adoption in community hospitals in Aunt Mini. So I think it's a topic that is burning on everybody's mind, but the adoption criteria or how do you evaluate solutions that in priorities in health systems are completely different? So I want to start from, even before we dive into AI or even imaging, from your perspective on health systems in general, what is top of their mind right now? What are their priorities at the moment?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, and I'm really glad that you framed the question in that way, and that we're kind of starting with that big picture, because I think it's really easy as members of the radiology and medical imaging community to kind of look at health systems through that medical imaging lens. And it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the truth of the matter is that medical imaging often occupies a somewhat peripheral position on the health system radar. Now, that's not to say that health systems don't feel that imaging is important. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I think that health system leaders and health system operators really do realize and appreciate the contribution of medical imaging, both to patient care and to operations. But I think there's a general perception that medical imaging, and especially on the radiology professional side, it kind of takes care of itself. And by the way, I'm going to step back and say that I am not, throughout this whole webinar, I'm not going to be speaking specifically about HCA and HCA strategic imperatives. I'm talking about health systems in general, and I just wanted to kind of offer that disclaimer. And that having been said, you go from health system to health system, hospital. You talk to the C-suite leadership, whether it's in the corporate office or down in the or in the individual facilities. And you kind of hear the same thing, which is that, the CEO, the COOs, they spend their days just putting out fires, and it's just one crisis after another. And, radiology is kind of that thing that, it's off the side, kind of humming away, just kind of taking care of itself, and kind of, if it ain't broke, let's not fix it, hospital CEO signs a contract with the radiology group, and then, assuming that turnaround times are okay, assuming that medical staff is generally happy, you don't really have to worry about radiology until the next time the contract comes up for renewal. Now that's obviously an oversimplification, but this kind of idea that, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, this can create a challenge for those who are trying to advocate for the introduction of new imaging technology, as I'm sure we'll get into. So to the question of what these health system operators and leaders are thinking about, if they're not spending their days thinking about radiology, well, you name it, right? Payer negotiations, contracts, shifting market dynamics, consolidation, and what that means for the competitive landscape, trying to manage medical staff and shore up the referral base, trying to optimize operations, build service lines, how to deal with new risk sharing models, and how to deal with new competitors, both traditional and completely new models entering on the scene. It's a lot. And of course, this was all before COVID, right? Which has obviously introduced a whole new set of issues, not just about fluctuations in volumes and fluctuations in revenues, but also about how to manage staffing and how to manage supply chains in this suddenly very volatile environment. So, again, it's no wonder that if you're trying, again, going back to the theme of advocating for AI technology, or any technology for that matter, it's no wonder that depending on who you're trying to talk to, at what level of an organization, it can be hard to get people's attention.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And I know maybe jumping ahead, but so essentially maybe a conclusion from what you're saying right now is that if you do want to advocate for new technology adoption, it has to link to something that is not necessarily directly imaging, but something else that they care about. Could be length of stay, or revenues, or procedures, or patient satisfaction, or patient experience, whatever. But you have to create the link between the two. Otherwise, it will be difficult to get our attention. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into that, into kind of how that decision-making process takes place. How does new technology get adopted in these systems? And there's a wide variation in kind of health systems in terms of how aggressive they are. Some are a lot more aggressive, some are more conservative as far as adopting new technologies. Some are more strategic, some are more opportunistic. But I think the common theme pervading across all systems is one of trying to identify value. That's the ultimate question, is how, what is the value? How do you show that value? how do you articulate the value proposition to the organization? If you can articulate that value proposition properly, then that's what it really accelerates the adoption of new technology. And to your point, I mean, I think that's especially important to understand, especially important to get across, is that these organizations are kind of coming to the table, if you will, with their own objectives, their own strategic objectives that they've thought about and they've kind of propagated through the organizations. And so I think that so a couple of considerations. So first of all, I think that if we're trying to articulate the benefit of any technology in a big organization, the trick is to start with those high-level priorities of the organization and work backwards to what the technology does and what the technology offers, rather than, unfortunately, what I've seen, some technology, developers do, starting with the technology and what the technology does, and then kind of trying to fit it into the box of like, oh, how can I help, health system XYZ? You really have to need to start with the objectives of the health system, which they have often articulated and kind of promulgated throughout the organization. Start there in order to fashioning the pitch, so to speak. I think that a second consideration is, and this is so cliche that it almost, it's so often mentioned that it's almost cliche, but it's the need to articulate very specific use cases. Right. And I think this is where radiologists can be especially helpful, because there's really no field that's better positioned to kind of offer specific examples where deploying a technology like AI is going to improve, patient care or enhance efficiency or save money or whatever. And then the third point, I guess, that I would make there, in this point is way too often neglected, is that the value proposition really has to be tied to specific metrics of interest to organizational leadership. And I'll offer an example of that. But let's talk about quality improvement for a second. There's I think a mistaken belief out there that health systems will not invest in quality improvement if it's not accompanied by financial gain. That's not true in my opinion. I can be cynical, but that's a bit too cynical for me. So in my experience, I think health systems will invest in quality improvement. But here's the caveat. The caveat is that quality improvement initiative has to be tied to measurable performance objectives that are of interest to the system. And typically, if you look at these, especially larger health systems, larger, more consolidated health systems, they tend to establish quarterly or annual quality improvement goals in specific clinical domains. And they're often specified at the corporate level, and then they're cascaded out to the facilities where the operators are held accountable to those goals. And so, and this is kind of, this is how tight management works in a big health system. You have kind of centralized goals with defined metrics, and then the health system operators, which tend to be, health system operators in general tend to be pretty focused, pretty quantitative, and pretty, if everything is running right, pretty tightly aligned to those metrics set by system leaders. And so, those metrics and those goals, those are going to be foremost on the mind of those hospital operators. And so when they're kind of hearing a pitch from an outside developer or anybody, they're going to be most responsive to pitches aimed squarely at those objectives that they're being held accountable for during that period. So if we're going to promote, let's say, AI on the basis of quality improvement, it can't be just vague, pie in the sky, we're going to make radiology better. Right? It has to be specific and measurable, and ideally a goal that particular system is interested in advancing at that particular time. So an example would be AI for stroke patients and for stroke care pathways. So, let's just say you have a large vessel occlusion algorithm, which you do. So you have a large vessel occlusion algorithm as well, and others do as well. So, it's just one thing. It's one thing to blindly approach a health system saying like, hey, we're gonna improve stroke care. That's probably going to fall on deaf ears. But it's another to carefully target those health systems that have specified improving door-to-needle time, say, as a key improvement metric for that year or that quarter. And to approach those systems and say, okay, in 6 months' time, we're going to reduce your door-to-needle times by 20% in these three pilot facilities. So, the difference there is that here we're articulating a specific metric, a specific target at an institution that has been selected to really care about that target and those metrics. And I think that type of pitch is going to go a long way.
Yeah. First of all, I find this really fascinating, and it's very different when you think about speaking with clinical leaders directly, radiologists, versus talking about with hospital operators and how they think about these problems. A question I'm curious about, when you speak to radiologists, are they typically aware of the hospital operators' main metrics and they know about these links and their role in those links? Or is there an exploration process where you need to kind of understand those points and then separately try and connect where imaging impacts them?
It's a really good question, and I think that probably varies from health system to health system, and it probably depends a lot on how tightly aligned the radiologists are to the health system. So, as we know, a lot of health systems have been looking into whether to employ radiologists or whether to remain with contracting radiologists. Certainly one of the arguments that is advanced in favor of employing radiologists, and I'm not coming out, I'm not coming out in favor or opposed to kind of different kind of structures there. I'm just kind of saying the kind of what's out there in the world right now. One of the arguments that's advanced for employing radiologists is this idea that you can bring the radiologists more tightly aligned to system quality objectives. Now, that's not the first argument you hear, right? The first argument is usually about dollars and cents, and it's usually made on financial grounds. But there's also, this theme kind of running through the employment debate about whether if you're a radiologist, as well as your other hospital-based specialties, right? Pathologists, your anesthesiologists, your hospitalists. If you could bring them in as employed, maybe you can more tightly align them to the goals of the system, and maybe you can better engage the radiologists towards advancing those goals. And so maybe if your goal to go back to the stroke pathway or whatever, maybe you have more engaged radiologists because they're going to be going out proactively and bringing in the technology to support the goals. Now you can argue the opposite, and you can argue that employment leads to less engaged radiologists, and I think that's beyond the scope of this webinar. But I think that's the kind of discussion that you take place, and I think to the point about whether radiologists are kind of aware of systemic goals, I think it's really variable. I think health systems, some do a better job than others of kind of communicating what those strategic objectives are. I think in general, probably they're better communicated on the hospital side than they are on the professional side, for sure. But that's definitely a key question because if radiologists are going to be coming in and advocating for certain technologies, it's certainly helpful if they know what the health system is going to be most receptive to at that particular time.
Yeah. And it relates to a different topic, which I know we spoke about in the past, but when people think about the impact of AI, for me, there is no real impact to AI. The question is, what is the downstream impact of significantly better radiology quality on a certain topic? So let's say you mentioned stroke AI. So with that, you can reduce turnaround time. The question isn't what the impact of AI for stroke. The question is, imagine you can have radiology service that now can provide even shorter turnaround times for positive stroke cases. Or let's take P as an example, right? It's or let's say quality, maybe that's a different example. The idea isn't what's the impact of AI that can flag discrepancies and help me reduce misses. The question is, imagine I have an ability to provide much more accurate radiology services for certain type of pathologies. What would be the downstream impact of that? And should the health system invest in better radiology quality? So it's much less about the tech itself. The tech is just a tool in order to enable much better radiology services, in my mind. And I think the question is, how how do you think radiologists that are involved in those major health systems should think about AI adoption? Should they be, should the AI vendors go directly to the health system and bridge it? Should the radiologists should be the champions and kind of try and I would say speak the two languages of, cost and revenue with AI and radiology quality? How do you think about that topic?
Well, maybe we can start with how I see health systems looking at AI, and then we can kind of cross the bridge over to kind of like how the radiologists can then engage with those health systems who are looking at AI. And so I see a lot of variation with how health system leaders are looking at AI and how they're talking about AI. So for starters, we've got those health system leaders, and I'm just talking generically about, health system, operators, C-suite, whatever. You've got like a big bunch who kind of looks at AI and immediately see dollar signs, right? Because there's this idea that if you bring an AI, it's going to replace a bunch of radiologists and you're going to save a lot of money. And specifically in an employment situation. So you employ the radiologists and you introduce AI. Over time, you cut down on the number of radiology FTEs that you have to employ, and there's a big cost savings. Now, I think this is a very naive perspective. I think most of the attendees on the webinar probably also agree that that's pretty naive. It certainly does not match up with where most people in the field think AI is going. But I mention it because it's a misperception that you still hear a lot of, and it's actually probably something that we have to actively speak against. This idea of AI primarily as displacing the radiologists. I don't think right. But then you have kind of other kind of viewpoints on AI. So there's this idea that AI is going to lead to operational efficiencies, right? It's going to improve workflows, it's going to reduce costs, it's going to optimize patient throughput. Then you have the AI is primarily a quality improvement tool, and we talked about that. There's also just excitement over AI because it's a bright, shiny object. And, it's like, we don't really understand it, but other people are excited about it. And the health system across the street is excited about it. So I better be excited about it too, because I might miss out on something. So it's kind of, that's the FOMO approach, right, to AI. And then lastly, there's that perception that, we have to be fair, we have to mention that a lot of people still do think that AI is just something that's overhyped and it's going away. It's not going to be important. I think that group is getting smaller, and I think that perception is fading away. The longer these tools are around, and the more integrated, right, they become into clinical practice. But there's definitely these different viewpoints, right, on AI. What were you going to say? Because we can kind of go in on that too.
No, I find it interesting that we have all those different perceptions. I wonder if how do you, let's say you speak about even those that believe in AI, I think that the question often becomes a question of timing, right? Even if you believe AI is the right thing, oftentimes is when is the right time? And maybe the question is, what metrics or things that you heard about it AI can deliver should be mentioned, you think, in order to kind of create this, I wouldn't call it sense of urgency, but I would say compelling reason to act in the near future. So obviously it seems like FOMO is a big one, right? So those group, I think that's easier, but those that believe either in operational efficiencies or revenue or quality, they really believe that there is the impact. Is there anything specific you heard about it AI can deliver that can, jumpstart them to action?
Yeah, well, so we talked about some things on the quality side, right? We talked about I used stroke care as an example, but I think there's several other kind of clinical metrics that health systems are interested in advancing in that AI can possibly help with. A lot of them right now seem to be kind of time-based, time to treatment based. So you can kind of take that model of measuring time to treatment you can extend it from stroke care to other urgent pathways. PE, for example, PE response, to the extent that organizations are starting to track PE response times as a kind of a metric for quality improvement, there's certainly opportunities there, for workflow enhancement through AI. And so I think you could go down the list on the quality side. Now there's also the economic side, which we haven't really touched on yet. And so, if we're going to make the argument that AI deployment improves efficiency, it saves money, well, that's sure to get people's attention. And so, you guys, Aidoc has released some data showing some decreased ED dwell times and decreased ICU lengths of stay, and I think maybe some hospital admission lengths of stay effects. So I'd say I personally have not independently reviewed this data, so I can't vouch for these data myself, but I have to say I really find it intriguing, and I'm really looking forward, I think as many do, to this data being tested and validated and hopefully reproduced. And if so, I think that's really going to move the needle.
Terrific. Yes. Just quick anecdote: it has been reproduced a few times already, so that's at least as compelling. But let's put it aside for now. Very interesting. So going back, I think, to the kind of unwinding the thread we had here, but I wonder, what do you think? So going back to the question of kind of adoption of AI in the health system, what do you think should be the role of the radiologist in that?
Well, absolutely to articulate use cases. Absolutely to be validating the technology, proactively validating the technology, and absolutely going forward and actually advocating for technology adoption under the right circumstances. And there's always this tension in radiology. Whenever new technology is introduced, is it going to get co-opted by other specialties? Right. So you and I have had conversations about this before, and there's a lot of resentment in the radiology community, I think, over time, when we kind of see our technology, technology that was kind of, birthed and kind of cultivated within radiology, and then other specialties kind of take it over. But the flip side to that, of course, is that the adoption of new technology by other specialties is a sign of our success, right? It's not just, and I'm not just talking about clinical and translational radiologists, but also the basic scientists, the engineers who have developed these extraordinary machines and these extraordinary software products that continue to just revolutionize the way we practice medicine. So, if there, I guess what I'm saying is that if there are turf battles over new technology, that's a pretty good sign that the technology works and is really important. Truth be told, from the standpoint of the patient and from the standpoint of the health system, it probably matters less who is using the technology and more that the technology is being used for the right indications at the right patient at the right time. But getting back to the question about radiologists, I will say for the record that I think that AI should be ours to own. Like it should belong to radiology. But it's not sufficient for us to say, well, hey, we're the ones reading the images, and so therefore, we should own imaging AI. We're going to have to work for it. And to your question, what do radiologists have to do in order to actually have ownership, keep ownership over AI? Again, we have to be participating in the investigations and the validation studies of the new technologies. We have to be articulating the use cases. We have to be demonstrating the value proposition, and we have to be front and center in approaching health systems and health system operators and leaders to get the technology adopted in the right setting. So radiology is certainly positioned better than any other field to do so. It's a matter of kind of, I think, adopting the right mindset and actually kind of getting to work in really championing the technology.
Yeah. I love how you phrased it. I think you're saying radiologists need to birth AI, which is interesting, but I think it symbolizes exactly what you meant. So it's finding the right use cases, being this arm that both finds the value pathway, like how do you link technology to value, translate that to the health system, and seems like you're saying also validates that the technology works and delivers that value. And you think that this is the radiologist role, that should be the radiologist role, if I understand correctly. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, and it just kind of goes along with a larger conversation about radiologists and value. And this is a conversation that's been taking place, for the better part of a decade or more. Can radiologists just sit in a dark room and read scans all day, or do they have to kind of go out and do more to advocate for themselves and to demonstrate their value within health systems? And we're always kind of looking for new ways to demonstrate our value, to show that we're not just a commodity item that can be interchanged. And there's been great work done by the ACR, by the RLI, by organized radiology, to try to give radiologists tools, with which to kind of demonstrate why they're differentiated, why they're important to hospitals and health systems. I see AI as another potential tool in that toolbox, in the sense that we can come to health systems and actually show health system leaders how to use these tools, where they fit in and how they deliver value. That's extraordinarily valuable to health systems who, and to leaders who, going back to the beginning of the conversation, who are basically spending most of their time putting out operational fires and not thinking forward about where AI fits in. I think it's a great opportunity for radiology, actually.
Fascinating.
Rick and Elad, thank you. I'm jumping in because time flies when you're having fun, and I think you both did an amazing job. We're into the almost 35 minutes, and I do want to give, first of all, just flag that to you, and maybe some questions from the audience, and then I'll let you both sort of say some last words as we address the questions. So there are actually questions to Elad, because we have some people here who are less familiar, I think, with AI in general. So maybe Elad, one of the questions is, how long would you say it takes an AI model to start generating results? I'm assuming when it's out in the field. Like, what would you like to maybe talk a bit about that, about what goes into the process of introducing an AI model into the market? Because we really haven't spoken about this at all, right? We took it to the very high level, assuming everyone knows AI and how it's being used. And so maybe just take us down a bit to sort of the ground level of what it takes to even go out with an AI algorithm solution to the market.
I'll try and be brief. So typically the first phase is product development. So because of FDA requirements, you can't start it. The AI that is in healthcare is typically not continuously learning, right? So you have to first develop it. You collect some data, you annotate this data, and you build a product, and then you validate it works, and it goes through the FDA. So that process depends how fast you are. Obviously, I'll share it with us. So at the beginning, it took a while. So first product, it took us over a year to just get to the FDA, and then another 6 months to get through the FDA. These days, it's more like 2-3 months. So it's obviously can get better as you scale, but typically takes about a year and a half to get the first solution out the door. In terms of generating results, AI typically starts generating results right away, as long as it's being adopted. The question of what do you mean by results? Because then the question is, how do you measure what are the results, and how does this impact the would be called a downstream effect, right? So let's say you want to measure length of stay. Let's say hospitalization length of stay. That's obviously an important metric to health systems, but to measure that takes a lot of time for AI, because you need to have a big enough cohort of patients to measure. So the results are generated right away. Let's say you do have an impact on length of stay. From the moment the system is adopted, it can generate those results. But to measure them, it does take a while. And typically, clinical studies for AI, again, it's so varied, but it takes a while, because you need at least a year of data typically to measure any sort of statistically significant results. Again, depending on size, et cetera, so it may be more or less, but let's say rough ballpark. So I would say about a year to a year and a half to develop initially, obviously much faster for companies like us that has been doing this for a while and have scaled. And then about a year to validate the outcome impact. And Rick, I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. One thing I would add to that, is this idea of getting results and validating results and showing statistical significance on results. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but a recurring theme, I think, for me, and one that I've tried to bring out in this conversation is the need to attach AI to specific quantitative metrics, because that's what health systems are looking at, especially large health systems that are operating at scale and cannot really afford to be kind of loosey-goosey with kind of more qualitative narratives. They really have to focus in on numbers and numerical improvement. And so, here you bring in a technology, and let's just say that the technology offers the chance to improve a workflow. It'll shave off like 5% of the time of the workflow, or let's say it offers the chance to save 3% of costs for some kind of care episode. You can pick and choose whatever metric you want, but a lot of these tools, the actual effect size, might potentially be small. It might be large, but like for tools that have a smaller effect size, we know from statistics that in order to kind of prove out a significant result, you need large sample size, right? And the smaller the effect size, the larger sample size you need, or the larger time you need, right, to kind of prove out something if you're working with a smaller sample size. And so what I'm getting at is that this is, I think, an opportunity for large health systems that we haven't really explored yet. And I'm really glad that this came up, because I think health systems, large consolidated health systems, are in a pretty unique position to contribute to validation of new tools, because they do have the scale, they do have the sample size to kind of perform these rigorous evaluations and actually demonstrate, demonstrate significance without having to take 10 years to do a study, because you're only working with like a 50-bed hospital. If you're working with thousands and thousands of beds and thousands of patient episodes, you can actually you can actually move that validation quite significantly faster. And I think that's an opportunity that has not been fully explored or realized. And I think that that's something that we should really push on as a community.
Great point.
Thank you both. And a question from another angle. Again, this goes back to Elad. I think some of the audience have not met us before, so this is a good sort of segue into that. We were talking about health systems and Rick as being an executive within a health system. So it's a bit of a top-down approach, but then there are users in the end, right? So how is this impacting? And Elad, again, it's a technology question, but is I guess our solution, right, doesn't require a complete shift in how users are used to using it. Can you talk a bit about integration and the importance, again, that we've learned, right, within the years that we've already been doing this, of really integrating into the way our users are used to working and not sort of changing that? Maybe can you just say a few words about that?
Yeah, I think what I love about AI is that there are so many stakeholders in this, and Rick, I think, mentioned this very well for health system, right? You have the administrators, then you have the clinical leaders, and then you have the day-to-day radiologists. On top of that, you have IT and then purchasing, right? So you have to have a lot of people that needs to be happy about this. So one of the difficulties with AI, you need to check different boxes for a lot of different people. So I think that the key that we found is this is why we're a very radiology focused company. So we really believe radiologists should love the product and the workflow, right? I think that's going to be key. And so the workflow integration, I think, is the biggest thing that radiologists care about. That and accuracy, of course, but those are the things that you should emphasize if you want to get the rad support. And then for the rest, it's different consideration for different people, and you always have to think about that. So you have IT, and what IT typically wants is an easy deployment and a good proactive vendor, and B, a way to scale, right? So they want to find a way that is more platform in approach versus a one-off solution. Typically, that's IT. Administration is much more about ROI and showing value. And again, clinical leaders care typically about outcomes and patients, and you want to make sure you can show that. And then radiologist users much more care about the day-to-day and workflow and see that it works. So I hope that answered kind of gave a sense. Rick, you probably have an experience from seeing the whole spectrum. So I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it brings to mind a lot of just practical implementation questions that are going to come up, as the technology accelerates and as deployment accelerates. And within these large health systems, there's a lot of questions about kind of what takes place at a central level versus what takes place at kind of the individual site level. And I'm not sure if that's what the question was getting at, but I think it's worth talking about for a second because I think health systems are going to have to develop a playbook, as things progress. And it's not entirely obvious, whether AI should just sit in a box on a central server somewhere at a corporate headquarters, and you've got one instance and that's good for the whole organization, or whether you're going to have separate instances at dozens and potentially hundreds of sites. And you can argue, both ways, like central deployment is a one-stop shop for maintenance and updates and access to data, but more broad peripheral kind of site-by-site deployment gives advantages maybe for customization and for kind of tailoring things to local needs and local preferences. And so, those arguments have already started to happen, I think, and they're going to, we're all going to hear those discussions more. And so I think that systems are going to have to kind of get out ahead of this and kind of, really kind of think through some of these things, anticipating a lot more kind of inbound questions about what this is going to look like.
And maybe, Ariel, I'll add one more thing. What Rick said, the playbook is really, resonate with me. And I think the question is also about when thinking about the workflow integration, how much you change workflow. The question is, who do you ask, right? So Rick talked about, which specialty, can bring the first AI. And I think this has workflow implications, right? So if it's a radiology driven workflow, right? So then typically the workflow is very well suited for radiologists, it's integrated in the workflow, and it has to be, because otherwise radiologists would just push it back and wouldn't want to adopt it. If it comes from other specialties or from top down, then obviously workflow may not be optimal because, they all care making sure that the radiologists are happy, but obviously you care about it more if you need to face the consequences of the technology in the day-to-day and want to make sure that the workflow is better suited. So I think the key that I think in kind of imaging AI applications that you really have to think carefully and practically about the radiology workflow and making sure that it's not disruptive. It's augmentative. It can change small things, but in the core of it, it has to be very well integrated and not interrupt your day-to-day.
Thank you, Elad. We're actually 1 minute before the end of the session. I do want to let you both maybe give us some final thoughts. There were a few questions about FDA and regulation. And I guess the ability of algorithms to continuously provide the value that they did initially when they were FDA cleared. I don't think we have time to really go into that, but maybe some parting thoughts from you, Rick, and then maybe from you, Elad, as well, before we say goodbye.
No, that's great, and I just want to say thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed the conversation. This is a really exciting time, and and I think that now is the time, kind of going back to that last question, that organizations really kind of have to think through their playbook. They have to kind of wrestle with kind of fundamental questions about informatics architecture and data security and privacy protection, and all the little boxes that are going to have to be checked before kind of widespread, kind of next level broad dissemination of this technology. And so I appreciate you guys setting up the conversation. Hopefully it's been useful to folks. And again, just really a pleasure talking with you this morning.
Thank you so much, Rick. Elad, any final thoughts? No, I echo my thanks to Rick. It's been it's always wonderful, but I learned a lot, so I appreciate sharing the insights. I think it's really fascinating. Thank you both, and enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you everyone for joining us and being so attentive and staying online for the 45 minutes of this session. We will be sending the recording. I wish you all goodbye and have a great day. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.